In June 1944, two men lay in the mud of Normandy, separated by only 100 yards of hedgerow. One was an American private first class, and the other was a German grenadier. They carried rifles that were roughly equivalent, and they fired bullets that cost about the same to manufacture. But the economic gap between these two men was larger than the ocean the Americans had just crossed. The American soldier was part of the best paid, best fed, and most economically powerful army in the history of the world. The German soldier was fighting for a bankrupt state, paid in a currency that was rapidly becoming worthless paper. This is an economic audit of the common soldier in World War II. We are not looking at their courage. We are looking at their bank accounts. To understand the war, you must understand that the United States didn't just outshoot the Axis. They outspent them on the payroll. Today, we analyze the paycheck of the GI, the hazard pay that made paratroopers rich, and why the British complained that Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Let's start with the baseline, the salary of a U.S. Army private. In 1940, before the war started, the pay was pathetic, $21 a month. But after Pearl Harbor, Congress realized you couldn't build a massive volunteer army on starvation wages. In 1942, they passed a bill raising the base pay of a private to $50 a month. Adjusted for inflation, $50 in 1944 is roughly equivalent to $900 in 2025. That sounds low, but you have to consider the disposable income factor. The Army provided everything: food, housing, clothing, medical care, and transportation were all free. A civilian earning $150 a month had to pay rent and buy groceries. The soldier kept almost every dime he earned. But $50 was just the floor. The U.S. military had a complex menu of bonuses that turned war into a financial opportunity. If you earned the Combat Infantryman Badge, CIB, you got an extra $10 a month. If you were stationed overseas, you received an automatic 20% increase in base pay. But the real money was in the specialized units, the Paratroopers and the Air Corps. The U.S. government placed a specific dollar value on the risk of jumping out of a plane: $50. A paratrooper received his base pay of $50 plus $50 jump pay. He literally doubled his salary by volunteering for the airborne. This is why the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions attracted the most aggressive, risk-tolerant young men in America. They weren't just patriots, they were economic rationalists who wanted to earn $100 a month. For a farm boy from Kansas who had lived through the Great Depression, $100 a month was a fortune. In the Air Corps, the money was even crazier. Flight pay was a 50% bonus on base pay for crew members. Officers in the Air Corps, like a bomber pilot, could earn upwards of $400 a month with flight pay and allowances. That is equivalent to a modern salary of nearly $80,000 a year, tax-free, with zero living expenses. Now, let's cross the line and look at the German Lanzer. The pay system of the Wehrmacht was medieval compared to the American corporate structure. A German private, Schütze, earned a base pay of about 30 Reichsmarks a month, plus a daily war pay, Kriegsbesoldung. Totaled up, a German soldier at the front earned roughly 70 to 80 Reichsmarks a month. On paper, at the official exchange rate of 2.5 marks to the dollar, this was about $30. It seems comparable to the American base pay, but economics is about purchasing power, not exchange rates. In 1940, the German soldier felt rich. He was occupying France, and the exchange rate was rigged in his favor by the Nazi government. German soldiers could walk into Paris shops and buy perfume, silk stockings, and champagne for pennies on the mark. They sent millions of packages home to Germany. The Wehrmacht was essentially a looting organization with a payroll department. But by 1944, the Reichsmark was a ghost currency. In Germany, there was nothing to buy. The shops were empty. Rationing was total. So the German soldier accumulated savings in a bank account that he couldn't access, for a future that wouldn't exist. His salary was a theoretical number in a ledger in Berlin, while the American salary was hard currency. This economic disparity caused massive friction with the British allies. The British Tommy was paid significantly less than the American GI. A British private earned about 14 shillings a week. Roughly speaking, the American GI earned 3 to 4 times as much as his British counterpart fighting in the same foxhole. This created a bizarre social dynamic in British pubs before D-Day. An American private could afford to buy rounds of drinks for the whole bar, while a British sergeant had to nurse a single pint. The Americans could afford the best cuts of meat on the black market, the best taxis, and the best dates. This is the origin of the famous British complaint: the Americans are overpaid, oversexed, and over here. The US government actually tried to solve this by encouraging soldiers to save money. They offered a soldier's deposit program that paid a guaranteed 4% interest, which was huge at the time. But most soldiers didn't save. They spent. This brings us to the black market economy, the real financial system of World War II. In the ruins of Italy and France, the official currency collapsed. The new reserve currency was not the dollar or the pound. It was the cigarette. US soldiers were issued cigarettes in their rations, and they could buy cartons cheaply at the PX, post-exchange. A carton of Lucky Strikes cost a soldier 50 cents. On the black market in Paris or Rome, that same carton could be sold for $50 to $100. That is a profit margin of 10,000%. Enterprising American supply sergeants became millionaires on paper. They would buy cigarettes, soap, and chocolate at army prices and sell them to civilians for gold, jewelry, or art. The US Army tried to crack down on this. They introduced invasion money, or scrip, special currency that was only valid on military bases. But you couldn't stop the trade. The economic pressure was too high. A German Luger pistol, captured from a dead enemy, was the ultimate cryptocurrency of 1945. A frontline soldier could sell a captured Luger to a rear echelon officer for $100. That was 2 months' pay for a single souvenir. This created a perverse incentive for looting. Soldiers weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for inventory. Now, let's look at the Soviet Union. The Red Army pay system was entirely different. A Soviet private earned a nominal salary, but it was incredibly low, often just a few rubles a month. But in the Soviet system, money was meaningless. The state provided everything, or it provided nothing. However, the Soviets had a brutal incentive system for destroying enemy hardware. They paid cash bonuses for confirmed kills. A Soviet tank crew or artillery unit received a specific bonus for every German tank destroyed. Repair crews were paid bonuses for every tank they fixed and returned to battle. It was a piecework system, like a factory floor applied to warfare. But since there was nothing to buy in Russia, most soldiers sent the money home to their families or donated it to the defense fund. The officer pay gap in the US Army is another fascinating economic study. A general earned roughly $700 to $800 a month. But the real divide was between the rear echelon and the front line. The men in the rear had access to warm beds, hot food, and safe paychecks. The men at the front, despite their combat pay, had nowhere to spend it. They played high-stakes poker games in muddy dugouts where pots reached thousands of dollars. Soldiers would bet their entire accumulated savings on a single hand of cards. Why? Because they knew they might be dead tomorrow. The marginal utility of money drops to zero when a mortar shell hits. Many soldiers sent their money home via allotments. A GI could sign a form, and the army would send a check directly to his wife or mother every month. This allotment system was the economic lifeline for millions of American families during the war. It meant that even if the husband was fighting in the Pacific, the rent in Ohio was being paid by the War Department. This massive injection of cash into the US domestic economy is what finally killed the Great Depression. It wasn't just the factory jobs, it was the 12 million soldiers on the government payroll sending cash home. But the greatest financial weapon of the US wasn't the salary during the war. It was the promise of what came after the war, the GI Bill. Passed in 1944, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act was essentially a deferred compensation package worth billions. It promised to pay for college, trade school, or provide low-interest loans for houses and businesses. No other country did this on such a scale. The British soldier got a suit of clothes and a train ticket home. The German soldier got a prison camp or a ruined city. The Russian soldier got a medal and a ticket back to the collective farm. The American soldier got a ticket to the middle class. Economists estimate that for every dollar the U.S. invested in the GI Bill, the economy got back $7 in tax revenue over the next 40 years. It was the smartest investment in human capital in history. But during the war, the disparity in pay had strategic consequences on the battlefield. German interrogators were often shocked when they captured American soldiers. They would find GIs carrying wristwatches, Parker pens, and pockets full of cash. It was a psychological blow. It proved to the Germans that they were fighting a nation of immense wealth. If a private could afford a wristwatch, what kind of equipment could his government afford? It signaled that the material battle was hopeless. There is a famous story of a German commander who realized the war was lost not when he saw a tank, but when he saw a fresh chocolate cake. It was found on a captured American jeep mailed from Boston. He realized that if the Americans had the logistics to mail a cake across the ocean, Germany couldn't win. The salary was just another expression of this logistical dominance. However, the high pay also caused discipline problems. In liberated France, American soldiers were often seen as arrogant conquerors because of their spending power. The black market activity undermined local governments and caused inflation in local currencies. The U.S. Army had to print occupation currency to try and stabilize the economies they were liberating. But let's audit the cost to the taxpayer. The payroll of the U.S. Armed Forces in World War II was the largest line item in the federal budget. The U.S. spent roughly $340 billion on the war. A significant percentage of that was just personnel costs, feeding, clothing, and paying 16 million men and women. How did they pay for it? War bonds. The government aggressively marketed bonds to the soldiers themselves. Buy a bond, buy a bullet. They encouraged soldiers to put 10% of their pay directly into bonds. This was a brilliant economic loop. The government paid the soldier gave the money back to the government to buy bonds. The government used that money to build the tank the soldier drove. It reduced inflation by taking cash out of circulation and funded the war effort simultaneously. The German economic system, by contrast, relied on plunder and slave labor because their currency had no trust. Ultimately, the soldier's salary tells us who won the war before the shooting stopped. The Axis powers were fighting on debt and stolen resources. The Allies, specifically the US, were fighting on the power of an industrial economy that could afford to pay its killers a living wage. The US treated soldiering as a job, a profession that deserved compensation. The fascist powers treated soldiering as a mystical duty to the state that required sacrifice, not payment. Sacrifice is cheap. Professionalism is expensive. But professionals usually win. The American GI walked out of the war in 1945, not just as a victor, but as a consumer ready to build the 1950s boom. The German soldier walked home to a currency reform in 1948 that wiped out whatever savings he thought he had. His Wehrsold was worthless. His sacrifice had zero return on investment. So, when we look at the greatest generation, we should remember that they were also the best-paid generation of warriors. And that money bought the loyalty, the morale, and the endurance needed to crush the Third Reich. They didn't fight for the money, but the money made sure they had a home to come back to.